March 24, 1987. Vincent Nelson opens the door to his Philadelphia apartment to see his girlfriend, Josefina Rivera, who has been missing since the previous November. Before he can say anything, she rushes inside, desperate and terrified, and begins explaining where she's been for the last 4 months. But the story she tells him is by far the most harrowing thing he's ever heard, as she details how she was abducted, tortured, and sexually abused by a religious figurehead called Gary Heidnik, with disturbing details such as being kept captive in a deep pit dug in the basement and being force-fed body parts of other women he had killed. Vincent struggles to believe what he's hearing. Josefina, it seems, had managed to escape by gaining Gary's trust enough that he was happy to drop her off to visit family, with the expectation that she would return to him with a new wife to join the other women he was holding captive. She was supposed to meet him at a nearby gas station at midnight. With Vincent still not believing her, Josefina leaves the apartment and runs to the nearest payphone to call the police. Officers John Cannon and David Savage arrive at the apartment within minutes, listening skeptically as Josefina recounts her ordeal once again. If she is to be believed, Gary has kidnapped 6 women in the last 4 months, including herself. 3 are still being held captive in his basement, with the other 2 having already been murdered. Though they struggle to believe her story is actually true, their doubts are silenced when Josefina lifts her jeans up to reveal deep scars around her ankles where her chains had been. And to add to it, this was right as the manhunt for the Frankford Slasher, a brutal serial killer targeting women in the same area, was in full swing. And the actions of the depraved killer Josefina was describing meant they couldn't help but ask, was this Gary the wanted serial killer they'd been searching for? So the 2 officers decide to head to the gas station where Gary is supposedly waiting in his Cadillac. Spotting the vehicle immediately, they approach with their guns drawn, causing Gary to raise his hands and question if they're here about his child support. Confused, they tell him that they're here about something much, much worse, wasting no time arresting him. With Gary in custody, homicide detective James Hansen and a team of officers, including Officer Savage, who made the arrest, head over to his home on 3520 North Marshall Street, breaking down the heavily secured door. Following the instructions Josefina had given him, Officer Savage heads straight for the basement. As soon as he enters it, he sees 2 black women lying asleep on a mattress under a dirty blanket. Both women are chained to a ceiling pipe and dressed in nothing but a thin blouse and socks. Later identified as Jacqueline Askins and Lisa Thomas, the 2 terrified women quickly point to a plywood sheet on the floor covered with bags of soil. Moving the bags and the plywood, the officer discovers a nude woman, Agnes Adams, crouching in a hidden pit below. Hurrying to remove the chains from the 3 women, they're taken out of the house to a waiting ambulance to treat their injuries. With the women safe, and Josefina's story confirmed to be entirely true, the police begin searching the house for evidence of the other horrors she had told them about. In the kitchen, a pot on the stove is found with a yellowish, fatty substance inside, next to an industrial food processor used for raw meat. In the oven, Officer Savage discovers a dish with a charred piece of bone that looks unsettlingly like a human rib. Any doubts as to whether these are human remains are silenced when the officers open the fridge to discover a human forearm in the freezer compartment. This is Gary Heidnik's House of Horrors. It would ultimately turn out that Gary's twisted crimes were unrelated to those of the Frankford Slasher, and it wouldn't be long before a 3rd serial killer, Harrison Graham, would be arrested after killing multiple women in his own apartment, only a couple of miles away too. If you want to find out more about either of those cases, I've linked my videos on them down below, with this exploration into Gary being the final video in my series of what I'm calling the Philly 3. 3 violent serial killers, who all committed similar murder sprees at the exact same time in more or less the exact same area of Philadelphia. If you're already thinking that elements of this case sound similar to the crimes of Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, you'd be right in thinking so, as Gary was one of the key inspirations for Thomas Harris's infamous serial killer. Gary subjected his victims to unimaginable horrors, forcing them into sexual slavery, torturing them and coercing them to torture one another, and even forcing them to consume the remains of the victims he murdered. An Army veteran with an IQ of 148, in charge of a religious group he founded with 50 members called the United Church of the Ministers of God, and wealth that far exceeded what was typical in his neighborhood due to savvy investments. Gary was seen as a little eccentric to the outside world, but nobody ever thought he was capable of the monstrous crimes he was committing in the privacy of his home. In fact, his congregation saw him as a respected and charismatic leader, gathering weekly in his home to hear his unconventional interpretations of the Bible, seemingly oblivious to the fact that 6 women were being kept chained in a pit in the basement just below their feet. Some have claimed that Gary's actions stemmed from severe mental illness, while others claim he was motivated by nothing more than pure malice. But according to Josefina, Gary's actions had an entirely different motive, with her claiming he told her, "I want to have kids, lots of them. I got kids already, but the state keeps taking them off me. Well, I got a way now of having kids so nobody can take them away. You're just the start. You're gonna have my baby down here, but not just you. I want to get 10 girls down here so you can all have my kids." While we've covered some dark and unsettling cases recently on the channel, it's worth stating up front that this is a particularly nasty one, by a particularly cruel and depraved psychopath. So be warned, this video isn't for the faint of heart. Without further ado, this is the story of On November 26, 1986, 25-year-old sex worker Josefina Rivera left her apartment in an impoverished neighborhood of North Philadelphia looking for work. Walking the streets in search of a John, she was hoping to earn enough money to provide her 3 estranged children with a meal on Thanksgiving in a couple of days' time. Walking in the rain and icy wind for hours in the dark with no customers, she was about to call it quits for the night when a Cadillac slowly rolled past her and came to a stop. As she approached the vehicle, the window lowered down to reveal a bearded man who asked if she was working. Relieved to have finally found a paying customer for the night, Josefina could never have known that she wasn't talking to a man as she accepted his payment. She was talking to a monster. Climbing into the car, he introduced himself as Gary, making a quick stop at a McDonald's to get some coffee, telling her he would take her back to his house after. Getting a good look at him in the McDonald's, Josefina was confused by his appearance. He was wearing flashy jewelry and an expensive watch, and clearly had a very pricey car. Yet his clothes were shabby and stained. Driving to his house on North Marshall Street, Gary pulled into the driveway of a dilapidated property that again seemed mismatched with his other expensive items. He even had another luxury car parked on the drive, a 1971 Rolls-Royce. Stranger still, when Gary went to open his front door, he pulled out a key unlike anything she'd ever seen before. It had been split into 2 parts, with one half of the key already in the lock. Inside, the house was just as confusing to her. The door opened into a small kitchen with pennies glued in place across the walls. And when she followed him to the bedroom, she found that the upstairs hallway had $5 bills covering the floor. All of the furniture was worn and damaged. In the bedroom, Gary paid her fee before the two of them had sex. Finished with their business, Josefina started dressing when suddenly Gary jumped her from behind, grabbing her by the neck and choking her. Panicked and taken by surprise, Josefina could barely fight back, pleading with him to stop. And just as suddenly as he'd attacked her, he released her. For a brief second, it seemed as though he'd heard her pleas, but then he yanked her arms back behind her back and locked a pair of handcuffs onto her wrists. Pushing her down the stairs, he dragged her into the kitchen and through a door that led down to his basement. Forced down into the cold, damp space, barely even dressed, as she continued to plea and beg. Gary muttered that if she didn't shut up, that he would hit her with a piece of wood until she couldn't make a sound. Now silent in fear, he then tossed her down onto a filthy mattress and fastened metal clamps around her ankles. He poured glue onto them to secure them, using the heat from a hairdryer to make the adhesive dry quickly. As Josefina's eyes traced the clamps, she followed the chain all the way up to a large pipe on the ceiling. With Josefina securely in place, terrified of what he was going to do next, Gary sat down beside her and laid his head in her lap. Before long, he had drifted off to sleep. Exhausted herself, with no way to escape, eventually Josefina drifted off too. When she woke up, Gary was gone. The only source of light filtered in through gaps in a small boarded-up window. Around her, she could make out a chest freezer and a washing machine, and what looked like a battered pool table. And in the middle of the room, she could just about see that a section of the concrete floor had been broken up, with a shallow pit dug into the ground. It looked like Gary had been digging up a grave to bury her in once he was finished with whatever twisted plans he had for her. Eventually, Gary returned with a sandwich and a glass of juice for her. Although she was starving, Josefina refused to eat or drink it. For all she knew, it was drugged or poisoned. Unfazed, Gary took the food away and returned with tools to continue excavating the pit in the ground. As he began hammering away at the floor, he started opening up to his captive, telling her about his desire to build a large family. He told her that he already had 3 children with 3 different women, though he had no contact with any of them. So he'd come up with a new plan to build the family of his dreams. He was going to have 10 children, with 10 women he planned to keep captive and impregnate. and Josephina was the first of his chosen slaves. I'm not sure what would be scarier, to know this deranged monster was going to kill you, or to know that he wasn't. Finishing his work on the hole, Gary demanded that she have sex with him again, before leaving her alone in the basement. Wasting no time, the second he was gone, Josephina began fighting to free herself from her restraints. After a painful and agonizing struggle, she managed to slip one of the ankle clamps loose and slide her foot out. Still chained by the other ankle, she launched herself at the window, her bloodied fingers pulling the wooden boards away. She tried to escape through the open window she had now revealed, but the other restraint kept her firmly in place. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't get the second clamp to loosen at all. So she pulled as far as she could on the chain and shoved half her body through the window, enough that she could shout and scream for help, hoping that someone in the rundown neighborhood would hear her and come to her rescue. But nobody did. Instead, she was yanked back inside by Gary, who began beating her with a stick until she fell silent again. Enraged, he shoved her into the hole in the ground, even though she barely fit, having to hold her head tightly against her chest. Then, he placed a sheet of plywood over the opening and stacked heavy weights on top, pinning her in place. As she continued to scream, Gary plugged in a radio and cranked it up to its maximum volume before heading upstairs again. Struggling to breathe, let alone to keep screaming, it wasn't long before Josephina gave up the hopeless attempt for rescue. After spending an entire day in the hole with no sign of her captor, Josephina had all but resigned to her fate. This was how she was going to die. But then Gary finally returned, and this time he wasn't alone. Before we continue with what happened next, I think we need to take a look at who Gary was, and how we ended up in this dark and disturbing place. So you know what that means. We're gonna have to go all the way back to the start. Gary Michael Heidnik was born on November 22, 1943 in Eastlake, a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. 18 months later, after the birth of his younger brother Terry, his parents Michael and Ellen divorced, and as a result he, along with his brother, was primarily raised by their father and his new wife. Clashing with their stepmother and facing harsh and abusive punishment from their father, the boy's home life was anything but happy. Gary's alcoholic father regularly mocked and taunted him over his bedwetting, going as far as to hang his soiled sheets out of their window for all their neighbors to see. It's worth pointing out, regular bedwetting beyond the usual ages is a very common trait among future serial killers. At school, Heidnik was bullied for having an oddly shaped head, a result of a childhood fall from a tree. Though he had few friends, he was highly intelligent, and he excelled in his studies. In 1957, Gary enrolled in the prestigious Staunton Military Academy in Virginia, intending to become an Army officer. Despite excelling academically there too, he unexpectedly dropped out before his graduation, and at 18 he decided to enroll in the regular Army. Thriving in the environment and regularly earning praise from his drill sergeant, he again struggled to develop any close friendships or bonds. After being rejected by a number of specialist units he applied to join, he was sent to San Antonio, Texas to train as a medic, before being transferred to a field hospital in West Germany. At the field hospital, he finally gained his GED, receiving an almost perfect score in the test. But by August 1962, just as things seemed to be finally progressing well for him, and he felt like he was finally starting to fit in, he began to suffer from severe headaches, blurred vision, and nausea. This led to him being diagnosed with gastroenteritis. But while he was being examined, a neurologist noted that he was showing signs of suffering from a mental disorder. Gary was prescribed a strong tranquilizer typically used to treat severe psychotic conditions and was sent back to a military hospital in Philadelphia. In less than 3 months, he was diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder, given an honorable discharge from the Army on medical grounds, and granted a full disability pension. After his discharge and diagnosis, Gary settled in Philadelphia, where he would go on to commit his disturbing crimes 20 years later. In the meantime, he earned a certificate as a licensed practical nurse and took some courses at the University of Pennsylvania. He worked various jobs, including at the University Hospital and at a veterans hospital, but was fired from them all due to his rudeness and poor attendance. As time went on, Gary's life continued to spiral downwards. He spent an increasing amount of time in psychiatric hospitals and attempted to take his own life on multiple occasions. While hospitalized, Gary was said to withdraw completely and become practically catatonic. In one disturbing incident, Gary was sectioned after attacking his brother Terry with a piece of wood. When he was released, he went to visit Terry as he recovered in hospital, telling his brother that if he had died, he would have disposed of his body in a bathtub of acid. Interestingly, His brother Terry found himself in an almost identical dark place throughout this time period, being hospitalized and attempting to take his own life multiple times too. Around the same time, in 1970, his birth mother Ellen, who had been battling bone cancer and alcoholism, took her own life by ingesting mercuric chloride, which only exacerbated Gary's already frail mental state. His behavior became increasingly erratic and bizarre, and he spent much of his time only communicating through written notes. Despite his unusual behavior, Gary's high intelligence allowed him to make a number of savvy investments in the stock market, turning his meager government checks from the army into a small fortune. It was at this point, when his mental and physical health was at its lowest, that Gary had an epiphany. He was going to found his own church. Whether this decision was fueled by any sort of real religious beliefs, his own delusions, or a desire to avoid paying tax on his growing fortune, however, is unclear. So in 1971, Gary founded the United Church of the Ministers of God in Philadelphia with a small investment of $1,500. He declared himself to be a bishop, starting with a congregation of 5 people he had convinced to follow him, including his brother Terry. As his number of followers slowly grew, he spent his time cycling between mental institutions and ministering services to them, providing him with the perfect opportunity to hone his skills in manipulation and coercion. Gary was also not a stranger to the police during this time. In 1976, he was charged with aggravated assault and carrying an unlicensed firearm after shooting at a man who was renting a house from him. Afterward, when the house was sold, the new owners discovered several boxes of pornographic magazines in the basement, alongside what appeared to be a hole someone had been digging in the concrete floor. Throughout this time, Gary had relationships with a number of women, most of whom were black and had mental disabilities, with his main goal appearing to be to have children with them. His girlfriend, Gail Linko, was the first to give birth to his child. Though due to Gail's mental challenges, their son was placed into foster care shortly after his birth. Similarly, Gary dated another mentally challenged woman, Anjanette Davidson, who he had a daughter with. But like his firstborn, his second child was quickly put into foster care due to her mother's various conditions. In 1978, Gary came under police scrutiny again, after he signed Anjanette's sister, Alberta, out of the mental institution she was staying at on a day pass, before keeping her locked in his house. Severely mentally disabled, Alberta was held captive in the basement where he sexually assaulted and abused her. She was later discovered shackled in a storage room in Gary's house, and returned to the hospital where doctors quickly recognized the severe nature of the trauma she had been through. Gary was immediately arrested and charged with multiple offenses, including kidnapping and sexual assault. Going to trial in November 1978, these charges would eerily mirror his future crimes. Pleading not guilty and defending himself in court, a psychological evaluation of Gary concluded he was manipulative and psychosexually immature, and he was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to 3 to 7 years in prison. However, an appeal led to the sentence being overturned, and instead he spent less than 3 years in mental institutions before being released back into the world on April 12, 1983. After his release, Anjanette mysteriously vanished, and many believe that Gary played a role in her disappearance. But with police failing to uncover any information about what happened to her, her disappearance remains unsolved to this day. In 1984, Gary then purchased the property at 3520 North Marshall Street that would later become infamous. Despite buying a modest house in a deprived neighborhood, Gary flaunted his wealth by purchasing a Cadillac and a Rolls-Royce for himself. This property would quickly become the place of worship for his church, with weekly Sunday gatherings which were mostly attended by vulnerable, mentally disabled people. Gary would regularly take his congregation on outings, such as going to amusement parks with them, and buying them burgers and fries. Many of his mentally impaired followers quite literally worshipped him, trusting him completely as he preyed on their need for acceptance, trust, and understanding. Living a double life as a bishop to his congregation, Gary's main goal was to find a new partner to have another child with. So he turned to a marriage service, where he met Betty Disto, a 22-year-old woman from the Philippines. After exchanging letters and phone calls, Betty agreed to marry him and traveled to Philadelphia in September 1985 to meet him. Married in less than a month, Betty soon discovered that Gary was sleeping with multiple other women, all black and with mental disabilities, after walking in on him. And it wasn't long before he began to physically and sexually assault her, threatening to kill her if she tried to leave him. He would even force her to watch as he had sex with the other women he'd bring back to the house. Reaching breaking point, on December 12, 1986, Betty confronted him about his behavior. But instead of resolving anything, Gary became enraged and viciously attacked and sexually assaulted her. 4 days later, after pretending to go shopping, she left and never returned. Though Gary wouldn't find out until much later, Betty was pregnant at the time and would go on to give birth to his third child. Less than 2 weeks later, and just after his parole for his last arrest had expired, Gary was arrested and charged with a litany of crimes thanks to Betty reporting what he did to her to the police. Once again, there was a chance for Gary to be stopped before his crimes got even worse. But sadly, Betty failed to appear at the preliminary hearing for the case, and as a result, the charges were dismissed. Throughout this time, Gary's church grew to more than 50 members and amassed more than $500,000 in its account, which is around $5 million adjusted for inflation. As his congregation gathered upstairs to attend his services, Josefina was being kept imprisoned in the hole in the basement beneath their feet. Among the members of Gary's church was a 24-year-old mentally disabled woman called Sandra Lindsay. Having known Gary for years after meeting at a facility for people with disabilities, Sandra considered him to be a good friend who had always looked out for her. She regularly had sexual encounters with Gary and another of his followers called Cyril Brown, and had once even become pregnant. However, not feeling ready to be a mother, she chose to have an abortion. When Gary discovered what she had done, he exploded in rage, calling her evil, and offering her $1,000 to carry his child, which Sandra refused. So Gary took matters into his own hands. Back inside the basement pit, despite the blaring radio, Josefina could clearly hear the sound of a woman's voice and the metallic clinking of a chain being dragged across the floor. Suddenly, the plywood board above her was pulled back and Josefina was yanked out of the hole by Gary. Her body barely even functioning, she struggled to stand, stumbling as she emerged from the pit to see another young black woman, naked except for a blouse, chained to the same ceiling pipe she had been on her first night in the basement. Gary introduced her as Sandra before leaving the basement. Alone with her, Josefina tried to engage her and find out anything she knew about what was going on. But she found Sandra to be detached and confused, quickly realizing that she was mentally disabled. Sandra calmly explained who she was, her relationship with Gary, and how she had ended up here. As Josefina tried to comfort her, Sandra began to grow increasingly frightened and distressed as the reality of the situation started to sink in. In less than an hour, Gary returned with what he called dinner for the two women: plain crackers and a bottle of water. Later that day, he continued digging the pit to make it deeper and wider, before he sexually assaulted both women and left them alone in the dark for the night. Broken both physically and mentally, the two practically naked women huddled together for warmth in the cold basement until morning, when Gary returned to bring them some oatmeal for breakfast. As they desperately ate the tiny portion of food, there was a sudden knock at the front door above. At the door was Sandra's sister, Tracy, alongside two of her cousins. Having been given his phone number by friends of Sandra from the congregation, they had already tried calling him for information on their sister's whereabouts, though he hadn't answered any of their calls. When nobody answered the door, they eventually left. Having immediately reported Sandra as missing, her family told the police that they believed she was being held captive by a man they knew only as Gary, living at 3520 Marshall Street. The officer assigned to Sandra's case did attempt to call Gary and even paid the house a visit, but he never received an answer. Knowing her family was looking for her, Gary forced Sandra to write a note to her mother, stating that she had left town and would call soon. When she'd written it, he told the two women he would take it to New York and send it from there, to make it seem like Sandra had run away. This singular statement from Gary told Josefina everything she needed to know about Gary's intentions. He wasn't going to let them go, which either meant he planned to keep them indefinitely as his prisoners, or that he had an even worse fate in mind for them. Unfortunately, Gary's plan worked. While Sandra's mother and family strongly believed she had been kidnapped, the officer saw the letter as an indication that Sandra had most likely run away rather than become a victim of abduction. Especially after a second letter, a Christmas card telling them not to worry, was received. As days turned to weeks, the two women remained trapped in the basement, starved and half naked, with Gary assaulting them whenever he wanted to. They occasionally tried to scream out for help, but their cries always brought brutal retaliation. Gary would savagely beat them, leave them confined in the dreaded pit for hours or even days, and torture them in cruel and twisted ways, such as suspending them from an overhead beam by a single arm, leaving them hanging in agony for hours. As you can imagine, with their bodies and their spirits broken, eventually they stopped screaming out for help, too afraid of the repercussions. 3 days before Christmas, with Josefina and Sandra trapped in the dark, cramped pit, Gary went out hunting for another victim to add to his twisted collection. And as he turned onto Lehigh Street in his Cadillac, he spotted the woman who would become his next captive. 19-year-old Lisa Thomas was heading over to a friend's house when Gary pulled up beside her in his luxury Cadillac, asking if she was a prostitute. Initially angered by his remark, Lisa softened when Gary apologized and put on his mask of charm. Unfortunately, he was able to convince her to get in the car so he could give her a ride to make up for his rude remark. Continuing to charm her as he drove her to her friend's house to pick something up, she soon agreed to go to dinner with him. So after she stopped off at her friend's house, the pair headed to a nearby restaurant. As the conversation progressed, with Gary flaunting his wealth, he offered to take her to Atlantic City the next day. When Lisa told him she wouldn't have anything suitable to wear if they did, he pulled out some money and told her they could go shopping and get her something to wear. So he took her to Sears, buying her new clothes. By the evening, Lisa felt comfortable enough to go back to Gary's house with him, where he put on a movie and poured her an alcoholic drink. Before long, with the drink going to her head, Lisa drifted to sleep. When she woke up, Gary was already undressing her. Before she could even question what he was doing, he dragged her up to his bedroom and forced himself on her. Once he had finished, Lisa started getting dressed as she asked him to take her back to her friend's house. But instead, Gary grabbed her by the throat and started choking her. He then handcuffed her and dragged her down to the basement to introduce her to what he called his friends. In the basement, he removed the plywood covering the pit and introduced her to Josefina and Sandra. I can't even imagine the horror that Lisa must have felt upon seeing the two half-naked, starved women stuffed inside the tiny pit, knowing that she was doomed to suffer the same fate. A mere 10 days later, Gary dragged a fourth victim into his basement, 23-year-old Deborah Dudley. However, while Gary had successfully managed to use violence and abuse to control his first 3 victims, Deborah refused to give in to him. From the moment he chained her in the basement, she defied every order and demand he put upon her. Despite being brutally beaten and tortured every time, she refused to back down. This shift in dynamic caused tension among the group of captives, as when Deborah disobeyed Gary, he didn't just punish her, he punished all of them. And the beatings and the torture ramped up to new levels of frequency and extremity. Whenever he left the house, Gary began designating one of the women as in charge, demanding a report of any misbehavior upon his return. When he came back, he would inquire whether anyone had disobeyed him. If the answer was no, he would punish them all brutally, essentially giving them no choice but to report on each other's actions if they wanted to avoid more violence. It was during this time that Josefina started to slowly gain her captor's trust, leading him to believe that she was loyal and submissive to him, and had genuinely accepted her role as one of his wives, a tactic which would eventually lead to her escape and his apprehension. Eventually, he brought a portable toilet into the basement, and some baby wipes for the women to clean themselves with. He also brought mattresses downstairs for the women to sleep on, offering them a small semblance of comfort when they were fortunate enough to be outside of the pit. After weeks of offering food erratically, Gary began feeding his captives canned dog food, enforcing compliance with violence until they ate it. Then on January 18th, Gary entered the basement with a 5th victim, an 18-year-old sex worker called Jacqueline Askins. Like the others, he lured her to the house before sexually assaulting her and chaining her in the basement. Gary's treatment of his 5 captives varied greatly depending on his mood. On some days, they were given the usual meal of dog food, while on other days, such as Josefina's birthday, he bought them a feast from a Chinese restaurant, complete with champagne. But any sense that Gary might be softening towards his captives in any way was completely put to rest in early February, after he caught Sandra trying to move the plywood boards off the pit to let the other women out from the damp hole. But he didn't beat her for her disobedience like usual. Instead, he cuffed one of her wrists to a ceiling beam and left her to hang by it for several days. It wasn't long before Sandra's already frail condition began to deteriorate, and after days in this position, dehydrated, barely fed, and running a high fever, she lost consciousness. When Gary released her from her handcuff, her limp body dropped to the floor, motionless. Accusing her of faking it, he kicked her, pushing her body into the pit. But when he checked, she had no pulse. Sandra was dead. Moments after Gary took Sandra's lifeless body upstairs, the remaining 4 women could hear the unmistakable sound of a power saw filling the house. Returning to the basement, Gary then took his newest captive, Jacqueline, upstairs to show her Sandra's partially dismembered body in his bathtub, before telling her, "We all gotta play a part in this." Gary then forced the terrified woman to cut off Sandra's arms for him as he watched. In the days following Sandra's death, an unbearably foul odor began to fill the house, causing the neighbors to complain to the police. When an officer came to investigate, Gary simply brushed off the smell as the result of an overcooked roast, leading the officer to dismiss the complaint and leave without any further investigation. In reality, the smell was the result of Gary using a food processor to grind Sandra's flesh, which he mixed with dog food to feed both his dogs and his captives, and from the rest of her remains, which he had been cooking on the stove. While the women struggled with the idea that they were being forced to eat Sandra, they had little choice but to obey or face punishment, which they now knew could even include death. Jacqueline was later quoted as saying, "If it wasn't for me eating her or eating dog food, I couldn't be here today." After Sandra's death, the remaining victims began secretly devising a plan to overpower their captor and escape. But before they had the chance to even attempt their scheme, with his psychosis and paranoia spiraling out of control, Gary devised a way to make sure they never could. He shackled their hands and feet, suspended them from a beam, and wrapped tape around their mouths. Then, he shoved screwdrivers into their ears and wriggled them around, hoping to deafen them. Only Josefina, who had managed to convince him that she was a good wife, was spared this torture. Josefina even began to receive small comforts like hot chocolate and hot dogs, and was allowed to sleep outside of the pit. Recalling what happened later on, Josefina admitted, "Anytime that you're cut off from the world outside, whoever's holding you captive, you're going to grow to like him regardless, because he's your only contact to things that are outside. He's your only source of survival." Even if she was quietly plotting her escape, her words make it clear that by this point she had started suffering from some degree of Stockholm Syndrome. With tensions between Gary, Josefina, and the other women escalating, Deborah's previous refusal to obey her captor intensified. So one day, Gary took her upstairs with the others waiting anxiously, expecting her to meet the same fate as Sandra. To their surprise, Deborah was returned safely to the basement. But any hint of fight she had seemed to have left her eyes. So when Gary left them alone, the other women asked her what had happened upstairs. Struggling to speak, Deborah told them that Gary took her to the kitchen and opened a pot on the stove, revealing Sandra's head inside. He then opened the oven to reveal part of Sandra's rib cage roasting inside. Next, he opened the fridge to show her various body parts, including an arm, wrapped in plastic. He coldly told her that he would do the same thing to her if she didn't start obeying his orders. While this intimidation tactic initially seemed to work on Deborah, it didn't take long for her to regain her composure and begin refusing to obey Gary again. So Gary introduced another sadistic method of punishment to try and force her submission. Using an exposed wire, he began to electrocute his victims by pressing it to their metal chains, watching as they screamed and writhed in pain from the jolts. Once again, he spared Josefina of this punishment. On March 18th, Gary decided on an even more horrific way to carry out his electroshock treatment. He drilled a small hole in the plywood covering of the pit and ordered Josefina, who he was now treating more like an accomplice than a captive, to pour water through it. With Deborah, Lisa, and Jacqueline inside the pit and bound by chains, he slid the wire through one of the holes, sending an electric current surging through all of them. Then, he ordered Josefina to push the live wire against Deborah's chain, causing her to convulse violently before collapsing face first into the water. As Lisa and Jacqueline screamed for him to stop and help, Gary eventually removed the plywood to see what was going on. Deborah was dead. The surviving women couldn't help but feel resentment towards Josefina, believing she was now not just cooperating with Gary to try and survive, but a willing participant in his cruelty, and in particular the death of Deborah. Dragging her body out of the wet pit and confirming she was dead, Gary showed no emotion, turning to the remaining women to say, "Now I can get back to having a peaceful basement." With Deborah dead, Gary went to get a pen and paper, ordering Josefina to write the time and date on the page, alongside a statement detailing her role in the murder of Deborah, telling her if she ever goes to the cops that he'll use it as proof that she was the one who killed her. Convinced with her obedient behavior and the threat of the confession letter looming over her that Josefina was now completely under his control, he unshackled her and sent her upstairs to change into regular clothes for the first time in 4 months. The following day, Gary wrapped Deborah's body in plastic, placed it in the freezer, and left the house. Except he didn't leave alone. While Lisa and Jacqueline remained chained in the cold, wet pit, he took Josefina out with him. Over the following weeks, Josefina accompanied Gary on shopping trips and went with him to restaurants, all the while maintaining the act of being his confidant. He repeatedly reminded her of the letter she had signed, warning that if he were ever caught, he would claim insanity, and she would be the one imprisoned, not him. He even made her share his bed with him at night. Alongside the change in Josefina's role, after Deborah died and resistance to his demands all but stopped in the basement, he began providing more comforts for his captives, such as pillows, blankets, and even a television. On March 22nd, Gary and Josefina loaded Deborah's partially frozen body into a van and drove to an area of dense woodland. Carrying the body into the woods, Gary dumped it among the trees. The following day, Gary took Josefina on a night drive through the streets in search of what he called a replacement for Deborah. Before long, they spotted a black woman on a street corner, who by pure coincidence both of them knew. Josefina recognized her as Agnes Adams, a dancer she had once worked with at a strip club, and Gary knew her as a prostitute he had previously paid to have sex with. Having had sex with him before at his house, where she was allowed to leave unharmed, Agnes had no reason to doubt Gary's intentions when he requested her services again. Back at his house, he left Josefina in the kitchen while he had sex with Agnes upstairs. But unlike her last encounter with him, this time she suffered the same fate as the other captives. She was stripped, chained, and locked in the basement pit with Lisa and Jacqueline. All of these moments helped convince Gary that Josefina was trustworthy, leading him to allow her to visit her family when she asked if she could, promising she'd bring back a new wife for him. On March 24th, Gary dropped her off near her home and arranged to meet her at a nearby gas station at midnight. As you know from the opening, Josefina immediately told the police what she had endured over the last 4 months, leading to them arresting Gary at the gas station later that night. In the early hours of the morning on the 25th, Detective James Hansen and a unit of officers arrived at Gary's house, breaking down the door to gain access. Among them was Officer David Savage, who had made the arrest of Gary at the gas station. Describing the scene, David said, "The stereo was going full volume and the TV in the dining room was at full volume with no picture. I went into the basement with a flashlight and observed 2 females lying on a mattress with a blanket. They were shackled, naked from the waist down. We said we were the police, and they started jumping up and down and hugging each other. They pointed to the corner, and I observed some bags of dirt over a board. I lifted the board up, and a black female who was naked jumped up out of the hole. She was shackled. We uncuffed her. All 3 girls started hugging each other and saying, 'Thank God we're saved.' The women were rescued from their horrific captivity and immediately given medical attention by paramedics stationed nearby. While the officers searched the house for any other possible victims, they found none. But what they uncovered in the kitchen was beyond anything they could have imagined. Sandy's forearm remained frozen in the freezer, and in the oven, they found charred bones, along with other body parts that would later be used as evidence in Gary's trial. Gary's crimes were so shocking and so far removed from his well-established persona as a wealthy and respected religious figure that they sparked a media frenzy. As the gruesome details of his actions were released to the public, many struggled to believe that anyone could commit such horrific crimes, or that they could do so without anyone noticing, particularly the congregation of his church who met every Sunday at the very house he was doing it all in. To this day, it remains unclear how much the members of his so-called church actually knew about his activities. Even after his arrest, while news outlets were broadcasting horrifying details about Gary's sickening actions, members of his congregation continued to gather at his home, dubbed the House of Horrors, every Sunday for worship. Gary's lawyer told reporters, "I was amazed. Usually in cases like this, the church is set up as a tax scam, but they really are holding services. After I took the case, parishioners were calling me and asking if they were still having services." Although I've not been able to confirm exactly when or why he was arrested, one member of Gary's congregation, Cyril Brown, was taken into custody around the same time as him and accused of being an accomplice to his crimes. Cyril had previously had a sexual relationship with Sandra prior to Gary kidnapping her, and he revealed to authorities that he had personally witnessed Gary dismembering her body in the bathtub, as well as claiming he had seen her head cooking in a pot on Gary's stove, and that he had helped label her body parts as dog meat. However, the prosecution granted him bail in exchange for his continued assistance in their investigation, with Cyril even claiming he was aware of a 3rd murder Gary had committed. Cyril's lawyer stated, "It will be our position that he was victimized to the same extent as the women involved, although he was not hurt. Cyril fits the profile of each and every victim. He's retarded, he's black, he's handicapped, he's slow." Cyril was so mentally disabled that he had to be asked the question, "What is your name?" a number of times before being able to understand what investigators wanted from him. Ultimately, it appears that in exchange for his testimony against Gary, given how mentally handicapped Cyril was, he was deemed to be a victim too, and he wasn't charged with any crimes. As the preliminary hearing for Gary's trial was set into motion, the other surviving women all struggled with conflicting feelings about Josefina's actions. She had saved them from the hell they had been forced to endure, but she had also played a role in their torture and abuse. Some of them even pushed for Josefina to have charges pressed against her for what she'd done. On April 23, 1987, Gary appeared in court for the first time since his arrest, represented by attorney Chuck Peruto, a well-known defense lawyer with a reputation for handling high-profile cases. Assistant District Attorney Charles Gallagher presented the state's case against Gary, charging him with a litany of crimes including murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, and false imprisonment. In a bizarre move, Gary initially claimed that the women had already been living in the house when he purchased it, and denied any involvement in their abduction. Strangely, this was the exact same claim that Harrison Graham had made in his case. Lisa, Jacqueline, and Agnes all testified about how Gary had chained, tortured, and sexually abused them over the course of their imprisonment in his basement, offering details that shocked and horrified the courtroom. Josefina also recounted her experience, giving vivid descriptions of how Sandra and Deborah were murdered, admitting to being the one who had pushed the live wire into the pit to kill Deborah. As you can imagine, Peruto tried to shift the blame onto Josefina. This was further muddied when the other three survivors gave varying accounts of Josefina, as either being a willing participant or as acting out of fear for her own life. Jacqueline would later state, for example, "She killed Debbie and we all could have gotten out of there alive. There was a lot of stuff she did she didn't have to do. I just thought she took on her serial killer ideal too. She was the oldest. She was supposed to protect us. Even though she was in a bad situation, she was still supposed to protect us." However, the district attorney chose not to file charges against Josefina. They determined that while she had participated under Gary's coercion, she was a victim herself and had ultimately saved the others. The final testimony came from Dr. Paul Hoyer, a county medical examiner, who read off a chilling list of the human remains found in Gary's home, with 24 pounds of human body parts found inside Gary's refrigerator alone. After the initial hearing, jury selection began for a trial set to start on June 20, 1988. Surprisingly, I'm yet to come across any clear indication that detectives looked at Gary as a legitimate suspect in the Frankford Slasher case during this time. Given at the point he was arrested, the slasher had killed 5 women, all who were similarly vulnerable and with similar mental health or mental disability issues. It feels like to me he would have been a solid suspect for the brutal unsolved murders occurring in the same area at the same time he was torturing victims in his house. Not to mention, Gary bears at least somewhat of a similarity to the description of the suspect in the slasher cases given by many different witnesses. Furthermore, Gary called himself a bishop, and there was a lot of talk about someone called the minister being involved in the slasher murders. However, given the slasher's crimes continued after Gary's arrest, committing another 4 murders that are known over the next 2 years, it seems clear that he was not the one responsible for the crimes. Whether he had an association with the person responsible, however, is less clear. Over the first 2 days of the trial, Judge Lynn Abraham and the jury listened to testimony from the victims, their families, law enforcement officers, and medical examiners. The case against Gary was solid and difficult to dispute. Listening to the testimony, Sandra's sister Tracy later told reporters, "No one can truly understand what it's like to hear in excruciating detail how someone you love died." However, Peruto and the defense took the strategy of trying to prove that Gary was legally insane. They relied heavily on the testimony of 2 key experts, psychiatrist Dr. Clancy McKenzie and psychologist Jack Apshey. Having spent over 100 hours with Gary, Dr. McKenzie claimed that at the time of the crimes, Gary did not know the difference between right and wrong. However, McKenzie spent the majority of his time on the stand ranting and rambling about his own theories around mental health conditions, making it seem as though he had another agenda to involve himself in such a high-profile case, barely even discussing Gary. Unfortunately for the defense, the testimony of Dr. Apshey also didn't go the way they had hoped, with Judge Abraham ruling that the majority of it, which delved into Gary's background, was inadmissible. Now desperate, Peruto called a third psychiatrist, Dr. Kenneth Kuhl, to the stand, hoping to salvage his defense, but this also backfired. After Dr. Kuhl's testimony was deemed to be confusing to the jury, it too was ordered to be stricken from the record. And under cross-examination, He revealed that he had only spent 20 minutes with Gary to evaluate his mental state. In a final blow to the insanity defense, the prosecution called Gary's broker, Robert Kirkpatrick, to the stand, where he testified that Gary was an astute investor who knew exactly what he was doing. Throughout the trial, Gary continued to claim his innocence and warned of the consequences if he were convicted. He argued that executing him would be the end of capital punishment in Pennsylvania, stating, "I say, real or phony, they can execute me, because I am innocent and I can prove it. When you execute an innocent man, knowingly execute an innocent man, you know there will be no more capital punishment in this state and possibly anywhere else in this country. And you know I didn't kill them two women. Go ahead and execute me. Yes, I want you to execute an innocent man so there will be no more capital punishment." On June 30th, 1988, after 16 hours of deliberation, the jury announced their verdict in the case, and Gary was found guilty of all charges put against him. The next day, the jury reached a unanimous decision and sentenced Gary to death for the murders of Sandra and Deborah, with Gary showing no visible emotion as the sentence was read aloud. He was sent to the State Correctional Institution in Pittsburgh to await his execution. For 11 years, Gary remained in prison, waiting as the usual legal processes surrounding a death sentence played out. During this period, he made multiple attempts to take his own life and took little part in his own appeals. In 1997, Gary's daughter, Maxine Davidson White, and his ex-wife, Betty Disto, filed a federal lawsuit to delay his execution, arguing that Gary was not mentally fit to be executed. After 2 years of legal battles, the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania ruled in favor of proceeding with the execution. At one of the hearings, Gary attacked his own defenders, claiming he wanted to be executed despite claiming he was innocent, stating, "Them women were down there killing each other. And even though I can prove my innocence, I still refuse to appeal my case. I resent this kind of shit being done to a disabled veteran." Ultimately, on July 6, 1999, Gary ate his final meal of black coffee and 2 slices of cheese pizza, before being prepared for his execution by lethal injection. That day, Maxine visited her father for an hour, but chose not to stay to see him be executed. Sandra's sister, Tracy, alongside other family members and the family of Deborah, attended the execution, as did one of his victims, Jacqueline Askins, who said, "I wanted my face to be the last thing he saw." According to Tracy, "I went to the execution, but it was too calm and serene for me. I'm thinking execution is something like, turn around and let me shoot you. Instead, they just stuck a needle in his arm. He never looked at us, never acknowledged us, never said he was sorry. He didn't say anything. He didn't even look in our direction." In another interview after his death, she stated, "I really wanted him to stay in jail. I wanted him to do time because I wanted him to not be able to run away from the women that he killed. Because I know that they spooked him. I know that they came back to haunt him. His death was so much easier than his victims." Similarly, Jacqueline was quoted as saying, "I watched him die. It didn't bring no satisfaction." And Josephina, who didn't attend the execution, later told reporters, "It would have been better for him to sit in a 4x4 cell." At the time of his death, no family members had made arrangements to claim his body. And 25 years later, Gary still holds the grim distinction of being the last man executed in Pennsylvania. After the trial, Josephina returned to sex work for about a year before managing to turn her life around, working various legitimate jobs and being reunited with her 3 children. She is now married and living in Atlantic City, and claims that years of therapy have helped reduce the amount of panic attacks she has, although seeing chains or handcuffs on TV still sets her off. Josephina ultimately went on to write a book called Cellar Girl about her experience, stating, "For a long time I was haunted by Heidnik, by the women who died next to me. But not any longer. I hope I can inspire other victims to feel positive about the future." Jacqueline continued to live in Philadelphia, finding work as a house cleaner and remaining close to her 2 sons. Suffering from hearing loss and with medication to manage her anxiety and PTSD, she continues to struggle with flashbacks and has not entered a basement since she escaped. In a 2021 documentary, Jacqueline had the chance to confront Josephina about her role in the events that transpired. After initially telling her that she used to hate her, she told her that she'd come to terms with the fact that Josephina did the best she could to survive, and that she's the reason the survivors are all alive today. Agnes and Lisa, however, both faced ongoing mental health challenges and addiction issues as a result of the trauma they experienced. Initially awarded a $30,000 settlement each, the the 4 survivors pursued civil litigation to access the funds in Gary's affluent accounts, seeking to divide the money equally as some degree of compensation for the crimes committed against them. Similarly, the IRS attempted to gain access to the funds, and it remains unclear whether either party succeeded in obtaining money from his accounts. Gary's lawyer, Peruto, later claimed that Gary had specifically targeted black women because he was trying to create a perfect race of children. He also claimed that there was no evidence that Gary had fed the other victims the remains of Sandra, but that he'd leaked the story to reinforce his insanity defense. When questioned why Gary looked unkempt with such a long beard throughout the trial, bearing a resemblance to Charles Manson, Peruto admitted that it was part of his plan, stating, "If you want to demonstrate that someone is insane, then they gotta effing look insane. During the trial he looked like a total whack job. Did I do that? Yes." In a recent interview, he even stated that, "I always regretted not winning it," in regards to Gary's case. What ultimately became of the members of his congregation, including his potential accomplice Cyril, is unclear, as is the extent to which they knew what was going on in their house of worship. While it's difficult to imagine none of them were aware anything was amiss, it is important to remember that his congregation was made up almost entirely of severely mentally disabled people, who Gary was able to easily deceive and manipulate. And with that, our exploration of this dark and disturbing case, and the final part of our deep dive into the Philly 3, has come to an end. Each of these cases, the Frankford Slasher, Harrison Graham, and Gary Heidnik, have all been equally complex and equally horrific. It's really shocking to think that all 3 of these serial killers were operating in a small area of Philadelphia at the exact same time, targeting the exact same sorts of vulnerable women, and were completely unrelated or unconnected to one another. While I know Gary technically isn't a serial killer because he only has 2 confirmed victims, I think it's pretty clear that he was a serial killer who was stopped before he could continue killing. Gary would have happily killed any of his victims at any point he wanted, and almost certainly would have killed more women had he not been arrested. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about this case down in the comments section below, and what you think about all the Philly 3 cases, and whether these oddly similar crimes might have had some form of connection to one another that I've missed. If you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe, and consider either becoming a channel member or joining my Patreon if you'd like to support me further. I can't offer a lot in the way of perks at the moment, so it would really just be a gesture of support for the time being. No pressure, but it's of course massively appreciated. Until next time. You have been watching The Mystery Abyss.